We're going to see both subtle and radical changes in what we eat and how we grow it in the coming century, and increasingly in the coming decades, in fact. The big paradox of our food future is an increase in demand from more people on the planet and a decrease in supply from environmental pressures in particular. So the big challenge is, how are we going to build climate resilience and intelligence into food production? So the most delicious foods, the most nutritious foods, the foods we love, like chocolate and coffee and wine and peaches and apples and berries, the really high nutrient, high flavor foods are also the most vulnerable foods because they need very specific conditions to grow, and a lot of those foods need water. So for example, avocados in Mexico, almonds in California, and all of the fresh fruits and vegetables grown in California are under pressure because they need very specific conditions and they need lots of water. So we're probably going to have a harder time producing those foods. Meat also is going to be much harder to produce, conventional meats, because 1,800 gallons of water go into the production of 1 pound of meat. Lots and lots of grains, about a third of all the grains produced in the world go into livestock production, meat production. So that will be much harder to produce sustainably in the next few decades. The foods that are easier to grow are the ones that we plant every season. So grains like corn and soy and wheat. It'll be easier to adapt those crops to more hotter and more volatile growing conditions. Now is a really interesting time in the meat industry because products like the Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, these are plant-based protein products that taste a lot like conventional meats and that are getting adopted into mainstream restaurants and so on. Burger King and White Castle and Shake Shack and a lot of food chains are picking up these plant-based proteins. But they're really only, for the most part, being used for these burger-type meats. The real question is, how are we going to, on a large scale, move the meat industry beyond animals? I think in the future there still will always be some amount of meat produced from animals. Craft meats and sustainably produced meats will have a future for sure. But there's also an area of development that's called lab meats or cultured meats. These are meats that are grown from cells that are taken from animals. Tiny little biopsies of cells are taken. The cells are given an environment in which they can grow in a laboratory, and they grow into recognizable meats. I, for example, tasted duck breast that had been grown in a laboratory in Silicon Valley, and it was a mixture of muscle cells and fat cells and connective tissue cells. All of that sounds really gross, but it was actually delicious and tasted just like duck meat. But what interested me is that conventional meat producers like Tyson and Cargill meats and so on are actually investing in these companies, in part because they're so resource efficient, right? In order to grow an animal that we eat, we put so much water and feed into the process of growing that animal, and we really can only consume less than half of the body weight of the animal. So if you can grow the meat without the animal, you're saving a lot of resources and money and environmental pressure. There are also food safety benefits because you're not harvesting the meat in slaughterhouses. There's not bacteria mixing in with the meat in that sort of meat harvesting process. And it has, a lot of advantages that I think will appeal to consumers. We just have to get beyond this sort of weird factor and this sort of gross out factor that you're growing meat in a laboratory. There's amazing applications of robotics and artificial intelligence in everything from large-scale agriculture and the application of chemicals and herbicides, fertilizers, and so forth. It's in increasingly aquaculture and fish farming. There are really interesting applications. It's in harvesting and automated harvesting, and it's even in vertical farming and these indoor farming applications. I'm also really interested in the way that we can teach plants to become more climate resilient using advanced breeding techniques, including GMOs, which is a controversial topic for many of us. CRISPR and other gene editing techniques are also coming online in a potentially very important way to help build climate resilience in crops. And the approach to sustainable meats is another really important area of innovation. So some of these things sound really scary and futuristic, but they may have nutritional advantages and even flavor advantages that go well beyond what we're doing today. The two areas that we need to think about as consumers in our daily habits are, number one, meat. Meats are by far, especially beef and lamb, are by far the most environmentally intensive foods to produce. So cutting back on meat consumption or switching to alternative products certainly is one of the biggest sort of challenges for consumers today. The other big area of focus for me and my household is food waste. More than a third of all food produced globally is either rotting or being thrown away. It basically ends up as waste. And it's an amazing number because it's, so energy intensive, environmentally intensive to grow this food. It's essential too to think about the impacts of climate change increasingly on food supply and our decisions politically. Who we elect into office and how seriously they're taking the climate issue is going to be essential to food security in the future.